Greetings, skateboarders. Welcome to another installment of It's About Skateboarding with Truck Bolts. Today, we're going to talk about how the skateboard got from this here flat piece, and I'm talking about the skateboard. We're not talking about the wheels and stuff today. We're talking about the board. Got from being just a flat piece of wood to the curved, contoured, concave, double kick thing we see today, and my role in that evolution. So I'm going to assume that not everybody knows everything about how skateboards evolved. So we're going to go back, of course, to the earliest times. A skateboard was just that. It was a board. It was a piece of wood, some discarded roller skate parts. You made a skateboard, and you basically just pushed along on it. Some of them had the crate scooter handles, but the kick turn and stuff like that wasn't really part of the original design, if you call it that, of a skateboard. But as the 60s came in and the surfers became, or attached themselves to skateboarding and started using it to emulate surfing, kick turning became more of a thing. So the skateboards were still weren't really designed to kick turn much. They had small kicktail stuff, but did it anyway. That became part of the style of skateboarding. So by the end of the 60s, people started thinking about kicktails. Makaha actually patented the kicktail. But the patent is actually just a rectangular board, and the kicktails are bent pieces of metal that almost kind of look like the sissy bars on a banana seat bicycle. And he even has a drawing with a double kickboard. But these are just drawings on the patent. Shortly after that, Makaha would actually release a production skateboard with a molded kicktail on the back. And that'd be the first departure of skateboards that weren't just flat. And along those times too, people were taking pieces of wood and gluing a wedge onto it. This is a later board. This is actually a board I made in the late 70s because I was poor, and I cut a wedge of wood and I made my own kicktail on the skateboard. This is probably one of the very first, I guess you'd call it the first deck crafters board. My friend Brad Roberts was kind enough to send it to me from years ago. So skateboarding had become surfing influenced. There was some skiing influence and stuff as well for boards like slalom boards and stuff, and still boards, those boards that still have basically no nose or tail because they were completely designed to use the trucks. Kick turning was not a thing. And the boards that did have a kicktail, the boards that were designed more for park and bowl and bank skating, which was becoming the thing, had a very asymmetrical shape. Tails were getting a little bit longer, and kicktails were becoming pretty common. There were fiberglass ones, wood ones, everything, metal ones. There was even skateboards in the 70s that were aluminum, and they were bent on both ends, and they had double kicktails. Still quite short, not super functional, but the idea of a board with more symmetry was there. Regardless of that, though, asymmetry was where skateboarding was going. It was all about surfing. Going backwards wasn't really, surf style I should say, going backwards wasn't really thought about much. Skateboards became for surf emulation in bowls and parks, things like that. So by the late 70s, laminated wood became the preferred skateboard manufacturing technique. That's what we have now, is basically the same thing. Laminated means different layers of wood put together and glued together. And when the glue dries, the layers stay together. So by the end of the 70s, everything was a laminated skateboard with a kicktail on the end. Pretty much everything. The sizes, the widths changed a bit, wheelbases here and there, but the average tail length, average nose length, which was like 6 inches for a tail, 3 inches or so for a nose, stayed the same, as did the design of the skateboard. It was just flat, laminated kicktail, and that's the way it stayed for a couple years. Now I've heard stories of Mike Weed making a double wedge tail board sometime in the mid to late 70s and riding pools on it and stuff, but I've never seen pictures or footage or anything, but I don't doubt it. So anyway, by the end of the 70s, the next innovation was concave. And it was actually advertised by Z-Flex to be so you wouldn't need wheel wells. They weren't even thinking about keeping your foot on. They were just thinking about by curving the sides of the board up, you'd have more room and you wouldn't need wheel wells and you could have a stronger board without having to sand the holes in it, you know. So by the end of the 70s, early 80s, concave skateboards. And that by I mean concave, that means just where your front foot was, the sides were turned up. The nose wasn't turned up, just the sides. Then the tail was just a flat plane. It was an angle, but flat plane, no dish or anything. So as time went on, that developed more. The front end became to spoon out a little more. Like when I started with Paul Schmidt, the nose had a little flip in it, but it still was only 3 inches long. But we were thinking about it. Actually, in the early days of the kick nose or flipped up spoon nose, we weren't really thinking, or at least most people weren't thinking, as a lever, as another kicktail. They were just thinking of a way of keeping your foot from flying off when you were slashing or doing airs or whatever. So the skateboard developed to where the back was a kicktail. Where the kicktail met the board, it was relatively flat, and it would get deeper and deeper of a concave towards the front, and then the nose actually started coming up as well. Okay, so the skateboard was still very asymmetrical. The front was made to hold your front foot on, and the back was made for leverage, and the early parts of ollies on vert and stuff like that. So that stayed like that for a minute, but we were slowly, as time going on, myself, I always added an extra 1/2 inch to my nose because I made my own boards, because I like to be able to grab on better, and if I did do a little lip slide in a ditch or something, I could kind of pop it back in or get myself up a curb, you know. So I was kind of thinking along those lines, but I still hadn't switched to completely symmetrical. So anyway, we're moving along. The nose is getting steeper. Noses are getting longer. And by longer, that's only like 4 inches, 4.5 inches. Maybe if it was 5, it would have been extreme. And still, the front of the board was very much the front of the board, and the back of the board was very much the back of the board. So, and more to the fact that, you know, you can't just do anything you want with wood. So to be able to make the first fully double kick mold wasn't just like to have the idea and do it, because you can't just spoon, like people were having trouble trying to spoon out the nose, because where it's easy to wrap, like say this piece of paper here around this just flat round surface, but if I try to wrap it around the top of my head, it won't lay flat because it's round. That's the way making a spoon is, or trying to make the wood go all these ways at once. You can't do just anything you want. So besides just the idea that a skateboard should be symmetrical, you had to figure out how to make the wood do it without splitting it or delaminating or just failing in general. So that was problem number one. But so everybody in general, it was late part of the 80s, all the concaves, there was Hell concave, the Schmidt Sticks concave had gotten super just extreme rocker, and the nose was flipped up, but it still was completely different than the tail. And everybody was heading that way. And then I started noticing people like Ricky Barnes was one of the main people I noticed. He would zoom along the ground because the boards had gotten long enough to where the nose was more useful nowadays. And he would flat ground. He would flip his board around forwards, backwards, and do this little flat ground line that he would do when he was cruising around street skating. Lucero, I believe, called them Ricky tactics. And I was like, man, Ricky, you just need a board that's the same on both ends. And I just kind of started thinking, maybe we need to get past this asymmetry because things were starting, their tricks were advancing, people were using the nose a lot more. And I thought maybe you just need to just go all the way and just make a board the same on both ends. And about that time, Paul had just got through pulling his first sample out of his the S4 footlock concave. And he was looking at it and he's like, oh man, I think I made the nose too steep. And I just had these thoughts of symmetry, and I'm like, no, I think the nose should be steeper. I think it should basically be another kicktail. And he looked at me kind of like, he's like, yeah, I don't know, that seems, it's got to have a front. And he didn't really get it. He thought he's like, yeah, I don't know about that. And I was trying to get him to kind of make something like that for Schmidt Sticks, but it wasn't where he wanted to go. So being as I worked for Vision as well, I decided to make a symmetrical mold. And eventually I figured out that by the way that the wood bent, you had to have those little hips. The way the kicktail comes down and there's those hips up into the concave, which happens to work really good and make a sweet pocket for skateboarding, is really there more because it has to be. Wood you couldn't make a kicktail on a concave like we do without it. And that was my first obstacle. After a lot of thinking and thought experiments, I finally came across that, and I made the mold. We actually contracted our molds out back then. I would design the master, and this guy would cast the molds for us, make the multiples of them so we could use them in the factory. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself there. Before I'd actually made that mold, or actually I was in the process of making it, I had made a double vision skateboard, basically. I made a skateboard that was fully symmetrical, but then the kick on the nose wasn't as steep as the tail. The concave wasn't fully symmetrical, but I had made a mold called the V5 mold, which had a pretty much of a kick nose. I had to cut down some longboard wood in it so I could get it out. We had wood long enough so I could get a nose as long as a tail. And I made a couple of samples, and I rode them at YMC skate camp, and all the kids thought it was they loved it. They didn't think it was weird at all. They thought it was super cool. And I enjoyed it. I learned how to do like nose pivots and come straight in and stuff like that, and it was great for shove-its and stuff. It was super fun. So I had that sample, and about that time, this is when World Industries and stuff was happening. I'm in my office at the wood shop, and Mark Gonzalez and Mike Vallely come into my shop. And they start talking to me about, Mark's trying to tell me, but he's kind of doesn't know how to articulate. But basically, we come down to he wants a symmetrical skateboard, something like that. He's thinking about those lines. So I show him my sample. But mine was kind of square-tailed and on both ends and diamond off. So he was like, no, that wasn't quite right. And so we talked some more about his shape, and I actually made him a sample shape. But before he ever got that shape, he had left and gone to blind. I didn't know this at the time, but that's what happened. But Mike Vallely, when we were having this conversation, Mike said, if you don't do it, I'm gonna. Which is make a board with a long nose like that. So I already had my mold being made, and shortly after that I made the double vision skateboard. And the production one, I already had a sample, and I had the fully symmetrical skateboard mold where the front and the back was no different. There was no front, there was no back. The nose was in the shape. The nose was actually as long as the tail. There had never been a skateboard where the nose was as long as the tail. So I made the production board. Most of the pros on Vision thought I was nuts, but the kids, I would see the kids riding it and they loved it. And actually Don Brown got it. He was the first pro that understood it and rode it. So anyway, shortly after that, Mike Vallely comes out with the Barnyard board, which is close to a double board, but the nose still is like an inch shorter than the tail. So they didn't go all the way to a complete symmetry, but close. Because now actually nowadays the nose is longer than the tail. So I was completely blown away. I was like, it wasn't easy to figure out how to make a mold like that, and they did it real quick because I knew they didn't have one when I was talking to them. They were just ideas, all that Mike was throwing around, and I was impressed. And but years later, I would see the documentary, "The Man Who Sold the World," the World Industry documentary, and they talk how they got the molds from the guy who actually would produce our molds. He sold copies to them, which made more sense to me because I knew it wasn't easy to sort it out so quick. So anyway, so after that, the floodgates were open. Skateboards became, actually, truthfully, it took a little while before the nose really got super long. Skateboarding started to get longer noses, but it wasn't till the 90s, mid 90s really, when the nose really got full size or even longer, because there was a time when everybody did big gaps and nose slides were invented, and everybody was doing nose slides. So the big long nose was good for holding your foot on big long ollies and for nose slides. So the nose got slightly longer. It's also good because it's a little more awkward to do a nollie when you're first learning them. So having a slightly longer nose, it hits a little sooner. So anyway, that became the norm. That stuck. So now the skateboard's actually longer in the nose and shorter in the tail, which for most of its life it wasn't. Very interesting. But anyway, so that's me rambling on about how skateboards got the way they are now and my part in it. I didn't do it all by myself. I'm not here to claim that I invented the double kicktail, or I'm the only one, definitely not the only one who thought about it and stuff. But I did take the step, figure out how to make it happen so that we could move forward in skateboarding. And I remember thinking, someday there's going to be skateboarders where you can't tell which way they skate. They're just going to be ambidextrous. And I would tell that to people, and it was hard to wrap your mind around it. Even for me, it was hard to wrap my mind around it, even though I was presenting the idea. But nowadays I see it. I see skaters that can do their tricks both ways, push both ways. There is no forwards and backwards. It's beautiful. And I gotta say, I'm proud to be a part of that development. And every time I see a skateboarder skating with ambidextrous style and just using the board to its fullest, it just warms my heart inside. Actually, just anybody skateboarding warms my heart inside. But anyway, that's the end of my story. There's probably more to tell, but that's it. Like I say, once again, I'm not trying to make any claims. That's just from where I sat. That's my perspective. That's my contribution. There were other contributions. There's other stories. Seek them out. Learn it all, or not, or don't care at all and just ride. It doesn't really matter. Just remember, skateboard as much as possible. This is Truck Bolt saying goodbye. Goodbye.